Hello everyone, my name is Geetan Karnaratne. I am a doctoral student at IBM Research Europe and ETH Zurich. Thank you for joining our demo. The title of our demo is Real-Time Language Recognition Using Hyperdimensional Computing on Phase Change Memory Arrays. I would like to acknowledge the contributions from my co-authors Manuel Legalo, Abbas Rahimi, Giovanni Cherubini, and Abu Sebastian from IBM Research Europe. In this video, I will first provide a brief overview of in-memory hyperdimensional computing and then explain our work and finally an example demonstration of the system. So hyperdimensional computing is an emerging computing paradigm that draws inspiration from the brain to guide next generation computing platforms. The brain operates by evaluating the state of thousands of synaptic connections at a time. Similarly, hyperdimensional computing represents data using bits in the order of thousands and distributes the information across all bits evenly. There are unique and elegant properties of hyperdimensional computing data representations that we can summarize as follows. So in hyperdimensional computing, the data are high dimensional. So compared to traditional computing where the data is represented using 32 or 64 bits, in hyperdimensional computing, the data is represented using 1,000 bits or even more. And the data in hyperdimensional computing are holographic, which means that the information is distributed evenly across all of the bits and giving equal significance to all bits. And the data can be now pseudo-randomly generated in the case of high dimensional computing, and they remain what we call quasi-orthogonal to each other. What we mean by quasi-orthogonal is that the data are not correlated with the other data when we generate them using a pseudo-random process. This is also explained in this bottom graph here. In here, you can see that the sample vectors tend to have a narrow and narrow distributions around a 0.5 normalized Hamming distance, which is equivalent to having an orthogonal vectors. And this narrow distribution becomes more narrower as the dimensionality is increased. So essentially, hyperdimensional computing exploits those above properties and perform comparisons and do some primitive manipulations of large but fixed length bit patterns. So hyperdimensional computing, as you can see here in this slide, it builds upon a rich form of algebra specifying rules to transform, bind, and also bundle different high dimensional vectors. And these vectors are called hypervectors. So first, let's take a look at the permutation vector. In this case, we transform in hypervector to another hypervector by changing the bit positions of the input hypervector. And after this transformation, the output hypervector that's generated is quasi-orthogonal to the input hypervector. And in the multiplication operation, we take two hypervectors, and then we do element-wise XOR operation between these two vectors to bind these two hypervectors together. And then it generates this new hypervector, and that is quasi-orthogonal to both of these input hypervectors. In the case of addition operation, we take two or more hypervectors as inputs, and we do a element-wise majority logic on each of these bits, and generates a new hypervector that is now equally similar to all the input hypervectors. So hyperdimensional computing, if you take it as a processor, it consists of an encoding module and an associative memory module. The encoding module creates hyperdimensional vectors for input symbol sequences by applying permutation, multiplication, and addition operations on an array of basis item hypervectors that are stored in what we call an item memory. And each of these basis hypervectors represent a basis symbol in the origin space. And this associative memory module stores profile hypervectors representing different classes. And these profile hypervectors are generated during training. And during inference, the associative memory module searches and finds the closest similarity profile hypervector given a hypervector uh, given a hypervector which is encoded through the same encoder, and we call this new hypervector which we use to search is we call it a query hypervector. As you have noticed, this frequent access to the item memory and the associative memory makes this HD processing a good candidate for in-memory computing. So in-memory computing, the processing is applied on data while the data stays in the memory. So in this work, we propose to employ in-memory crossbar arrays to implement both encoding operation as well as the associative memory search operation. In the case of encoding operation, we store the item memory hypervectors along the rows of crossbar array, and we perform an approximate encoding using a two min-term based in-memory read logic operation. In the case of associative memory search, we store the profile hypervectors along the columns of the crossbar array, and we perform the associative memory search operation using an approximate binary dot product operation. For those who are interested in further details about these implementations, are kindly referred to this Nature Electronics publication from our group last year. So to summarize, our results show that this system, which includes a PCM crossbar array and some peripheral circuits designed with 65 nanometer CMOS technology, is 6 times more energy efficient compared to a dedicated 65 nanometer technology digital CMOS accelerator, while still retaining the classification accuracy within 3 percentage points compared to the software implementation. And this is across two datasets, the language recognition dataset and the news classification dataset. So we tested our proposed system using an experimental PCM platform, which includes 3 million PCM devices. And the experiment required 220,000 devices to implement the associative memory and 540,000 devices to implement the item memory of the encoding part. And in total, we use 760,000 devices, thus becoming the largest scale demonstration of in-memory hyperdimensional computing to date. Our experimental platform comprises of a baseboard, and this baseboard has a high-performance analog front end that contains digital to analog converters, along with the digital electronics such as power supplies, voltages, and current references. Secondly, it has an FPGA board that implements the data acquisition and digital logic to interface with the PCM device under test and with all the electronics of the baseboard. Thirdly, it has a second FPGA board with an embedded processor and an internet connection that implements the overall system control and data management, as well as the interface with the host computer. Last but not least, we have the card which contains the prototype PCM chip. So this prototype PCM chip has 3 million devices. In addition to the PCM cells, the prototype PCM chip integrates the circuitry for cell addressing, on-chip ADCs for cell readout, and voltage and current mode cell programming. During the remainder of the talk, I would like to introduce you to one of the demonstrations of in-memory hyperdimensional computing system. And here we look at a real-time language recognition problem. In this problem, we let the system run on an experimental platform and determine the language of a query sentence. So for this, we developed a MATLAB-based graphical user interface on the host computer. As this interface is shown on this figure here. The front end of this interface supports inserting a query sentence through this text box, and it accepts input queries from any of these 22 languages, and all these languages are based on the Latin alphabet. The application supports 3 modes of operation. So the first mode is where it runs the inference on the software of the host processor itself to detect the language of the query sentence. In the second mode, which is of the interest to us in this demo, it runs inference on the PCM chip. So in this case, the query sentence is transmitted to the prototype PCM chip, which has the item memory and the associative memory already programmed on the array. With the help from item memory in the PCM array, a query hypervector is constructed and used to match against the profile hypervectors that are also on the PCM array. So the third mode is used to incrementally train the model further. In this case, the query hypervector is used to update the corresponding profile hypervectors. Once a query sentence is written with adequate length, the application allows submitting it for processing on the PCM chip. So the query is then, once you click the submit button, the query is uploaded to the chip as seen in this graph. Once the PCM chip has finished processing and when it has generated the result, this predicted result is returned back to the host computer and it appears on this part of the user interface. And once you click this reset button, you would be able to resubmit a new query using the same procedure. Now let's have a look at this application in action in real time. So that concludes the presentation. I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments, and some of you may be interested in trying out our demo platform. So you can send your queries during our live session. So looking forward to your interaction, and thank you for your attention.